Welcome to Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The Gila River Indian community in Arizona is working on a tribal law codifying banishment as a formal means of punishment. If adopted, it would be a first for tribes in the state. Several other tribes around the country have used what is an established tradition for members who break laws or go against tribal customs. Some of those tribes have run into complications about enforcing the practice in a modern legal framework. We'll hear about the history and contemporary applications of tribal banishment right after the news.
This is National Native News. I'm Brian Bull, sitting in for Antonia Gonzalez. The state of Alaska wants the U.S. Supreme Court to decide whether rural residents, which includes many Alaska Native people, should maintain subsistence fishing preference in the waterways of federal lands. KYUK reports that last month, a panel of federal appeals court judges sided with the federal government in its lawsuit against the state over salmon management on the Kuskokwim River. The Fed sued the state after clashes over fish management on the lower river in 2021 and 2022. Indigenous groups, including the Kuskokwim Intertribal Fish Commission and the Alaska Federation of Natives, signed on to the case in support of the federal government, which is advocating for a rural Alaska preference. But on Monday, the state asked the U.S. Supreme Court to take up the case, arguing that federal law shows that the state has the authority over its own waterways, even on federal land. On Tuesday, the New Mexico congressional delegation and Pueblo leaders held a press conference outside the Capitol in Washington, D.C. They urged Congress and the Trump administration to continue upholding protections for Chaco Canyon against oil and gas drilling. KUNM's Jeanette DeDios has more.
In 2023, former Interior Secretary Deb Haaland created a 10-mile buffer zone for Chaco Canyon National Historical Park that prevents any oil and gas drilling for 20 years. But with the new presidential administration, the buffer zone is being reconsidered. Among the Pueblo leaders that spoke, Governor of Santa Ana, Myron Armijo, urged Acting Interior Secretary Doug Burgum to visit Chaco Canyon.
It's a very sacred place. I've witnessed it. Our ancestors are there. When we pray, you can feel it. You can feel it in your body that they're talking to you. They're talking to us.
Representative Teresa Ledger Fernandez reaffirmed that Bergman had committed to a meeting with tribal leaders.
You told me you would. Live up to your word. Live up to the commitment you made in committee when I asked you.
U.S. Senator Martin Heinrich discussed a past visit by former Interior Secretary David Bernhardt to Chaco Canyon.
He realized, as a result of meaningfully consulting with tribal leadership in that place, that Chaco Canyon is not a museum. It is a living cultural landscape with direct relationships with the Pueblos today. And that's the difference.
While Pueblo leaders are committed to preserving the cultural site, the Navajo Nation sued the Interior Department in January in an attempt to reverse the buffer zone to 5 miles instead of 10, noting that it harmed tribal members who depend on oil and gas drilling in the area.
For National Native News, I'm Jeanette DeDios.
To offset declining crab and salmon fisheries, communities along Alaska's coast have turned to kelp, or seaweed. The Shunak tribe of Kodiak won a milestone $2.3 million grant to process locally grown kelp. The tribe owns and operates Kodiak Island Wild Source, the only seafood plant in town that processes kelp. Its main products are frozen and smoked salmon, cod, and halibut. Wild Source President Chris Sanitos says since adapting its facility to dry and preserve kelp, it's hard to keep up with demand.
Boy, some years it's really a bumper crop. When the lighting is right and the seed stock was good, it really grows well in Kodiak.
Sanitos says the new processing plant should boost the tribe's earnings and diversify the local economy. Sanitos says when kelp is added to soil, it absorbs water and helps plant withstand drought. It also encourages root growth and is a sought-after ingredient in the emerging biostimulant industry. Alaska Mariculture Cluster awarded the grant. It received its funding through the U.S. Economic Development Administration's Build Back Better program. This is National Native News. I'm Brian Bull.
National Native News is produced by Koahnic Broadcast Corporation with funding by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Support by Drummond Woodsum, a full-service law firm whose nationally recognized tribal nations practice provides services to tribal nations and their enterprises and to companies that do business with tribes across the country. More at dwmlaw.com. Support for journalism that raises the awareness of child well-being to citizens and to policymakers provided by the Annie E. Casey Foundation, building a brighter future for children, families, and communities. Information at aecf.org.
Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.
This is Native America Calling. I'm Sean Spruce. The Gila River Indian community in Arizona is seeking input from its citizens on a proposal to banish tribal members who commit violent crimes. Arizona Luminaria News says it would be the first tribal government in the state to formalize banishment into tribal law. Elsewhere, some tribes, like the village of Togiak in Alaska, actively use banishment to try and combat an alcohol and drug problem in the community. Today we'll explore the traditional practice of banishment, what it accomplishes, and its limits in the modern legal system. We also want to hear from you. Please, listeners, join the conversation. Has your tribe banished anyone? How is banishment viewed by your community? Is it a topic that you folks talk about where you live? Join us. Call 1-800-996-2848. That's also 1-800-99-NATIVE. Joining us now from the Outer Banks of North Carolina is David E. Wilkins. He's a professor at the University of Richmond. He is Lumbee. David, hello, and welcome back to Native America Calling.
Hello, Sean. Thank you for letting me be here.
You bet, David. Joining us from New York is J.C. Seneca. He is the president of the Seneca Nation. President Seneca, welcome back to the show. It's always a pleasure to have you.
No, Scano, thank you for having me.
Joining us from Ann Arbor, Michigan, we have Matthew Fletcher. He is a law professor at the University of Michigan Law School and author of the Turtle Talk blog. He's also a member of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians. He's a frequent guest here on Native America Calling. Matthew, hello and welcome back.
Hello, how you doing, Sean? It's good to be here.
Doing well. Thank you for asking, brother. And joining us from Togiak, Alaska, we have Anisha Kritz. She is the president of Togiak Traditional Council. She is Yupik. President Kritz, good morning. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Welcome.
Yes, good morning, and welcome everybody for letting us join in.
Absolutely. Looking forward to this conversation. And David, I'm going to go ahead and begin with you today. As we speak, the Gila River Indian community in Arizona deciding whether to banish and disenroll certain tribal members. Now, you've studied this issue, and you found that it's rare for tribal nations to have banishment codified into their tribal laws. Can you give us any examples of tribes currently using banishment to address crime? How's it working out?
There are a handful of tribes that have formally instituted banishment, but it was something that didn't really appear until the late 1990s. Historically, our communities, just like communities around the world, engaged in banishment or exile or expulsion or eviction or exclusion when individuals got out of hand. But it was a rarity in any country because Native peoples are largely, kin-based societies in which we are related to one another. And so the idea of excluding somebody that you're related to is not something that tribal communities made lightly because they are your relatives. But there have been a number of tribes in recent years. The Tiwa, Elected del Sur Pueblo, instituted it in the early 1990s. There are tribes in northern Minnesota that have also instituted it. I know the Cheyenne River Sioux also banished some folks back in 2015. And the Saginaw Chippewa tribe of Michigan They've also banished individuals. So, and according to the research that my wife and I did in our book, we identified at least 30 tribes as of 2017 that had banished individuals. And sometimes they would also disenroll them, which is a very different kind of process. But banishment is really the social and physical exclusion of individuals who violate social norms in Native communities. And historically, we tried to maintain cohesion. We engaged in rehabilitation, mediation, and restitution to try and help an individual get their act together. But sometimes when egregious offenses were committed, like premeditated murder or rape or incest with a child, individuals would be banished. So it's something that we've done historically, although it was historically a rare phenomenon for Native people to do it to their own kin.
Well, thank you, David. President Seneca, I want to bring you in now. And you worked with the New York State Legislature on a bill to strengthen enforcement of crimes like drug trafficking on the Seneca Nation. Now, I understand you prefer to use the word exclusion instead of banishment, but tell us more how exclusion can apply to this bill.
Well, exclusion basically is targeted towards non-native people on our territory, most predominantly with the drug traffickers that come on our territory and set up shop and take advantage of our women and impregnate them, get them to turn them to prostitution so that they're able to do their business, sell their drugs on our territory. And so it's been difficult. Certainly back in 1948, the federal government gave criminal jurisdiction over to the state of New York, and it really hasn't worked. And so we're advocating also on the federal level in regards to changes to that law. But in the meantime, we're also advocating, and we have advocated in the legislature of the state of New York, in changing some of the laws that are in existence now, Section 8 of the New York Indian Law, which is basically a trespass intruder law, to give us more teeth to be able to remove individuals from our territory that are engaged in these types of activities. And so we went through the legislative process. The legislature passed it. And now we're just waiting for the governor to sign the bill, which she's been delaying. I don't know why she's delaying it. I've met with her on a couple instances and encouraged her to sign the bill as a priority, and she continues to fail to do that. And I sent a letter just out yesterday to encourage her to be able to get this done so that we're able to take advantage and utilize this new law to help us remove these individuals from our territory. And so as far as exclusion goes, those have been also targeted towards that area. In some instances, the council has to take action in regards to if it's a member of our nation to exclude them, and which we have done, because certainly if they're dealing in drugs, they're a drug dealer, whether it's non-native or native or a member of our nation. And so in that instance, we do put a time limit on it that the individual has an opportunity to rehabilitate, to prove themselves that they haven't been in trouble, that they've quit dealing in drugs and that type of area, and then be able to come back to the council to be able to be reinstated or have the exclusion lifted. So that's where we're at with that.
Okay, well, tell us more about, can you give us any examples of how this exclusion has worked? Perhaps, like you mentioned, a tribal citizen who is excluded and then comes back before council and gets reinstated. Have you had success like that?
We've just started doing these exclusions over the last several months since in my administration here. Predominantly the exclusions that have occurred in the past by other leadership have been non-native. So in this administration, this is the first of its kind, I guess you want to say, where members have been excluded. And so we're hopeful that they can rehabilitate themselves, that they can change their lives and be on a different path, so that these exclusions can be lifted and they can become back in part of our nation.
What are you hearing from tribal citizens, President Seneca? Do they support this, or are they optimistic that exclusion could be a means to make the community healthier and safer.
I believe so, yes. I've had very positive feedback from our people in regards to that. And so when we do approach these things, these are very serious issues that we're dealing with. We have to do our homework. We have to make sure that we're making good and right decisions in regards to these exclusion orders. And in instances where members have been dealing in drugs and people have basically died at their homes by the use of drugs and their activity, those are, the top ones that we have been going after in regards to a drug house or a drug home, and even ones that have children in it, because children should not be around any type of drugs or use of drugs or the dealing of drugs. And so if they're causing harm to children or their family in regards to this, then we need to take action in regards to that, and that's what we've been doing.
Speaking of children, let's say a tribal citizen is excluded. Does any of that impact their children, their kin, peers, parents, siblings?
I would say, yeah, certainly it's an impact. Certainly, each and every one of us know of somebody or a relative that's struggled with addiction or alcohol, and it touches the fabric of our people. And we have to make sure that we protect our people, that we have a safe environment to raise their family in, and certainly we have to look out for the young ones and our elders to make sure that they're being protected as well, and that they are not surrounded by drugs dealers or drugs within their home, because that would have a major effect, a detriment on their lives and affect them greatly. And so, it's all about ensuring a better environment and protecting the elders and children from these types of things.
The phone number to call if you would like to join our conversation today here on Native America Calling is 1-800-996-2848. We're exploring the traditional practice of banishment, or as the Seneca Nation describes it, exclusion, and we'd like to get input, feedback from listeners today. Maybe you have personal experience with banishment, or you're familiar with a situation with a member of your tribe or a neighboring tribe where this occurred. We'd like to get your feedback here. Share your experience, share your insights, or perhaps ask a question. Phone number is 1-800-996-2848. Stay with us, and we will be right back. Ojibwe writer Angeline Bully is out with the third novel in a series of loosely connected thrillers based on a fictionalized version of her Michigan tribal community. Like her previous two novels, Sisters in the Wind features a teenage protagonist who navigates issues like foster care, tribal identity, and trauma. We'll talk with Bully on the next Native America Calling.
Support provided by Amerind. Amerind is 100% tribally owned and partners with tribes and their businesses to provide affordable commercial insurance coverage, protect tribal sovereignty, and strengthen Native American communities by helping to keep dollars in Indian country. Information about property, liability, commercial auto, and workers' comp available at amerind.com. That's AMERIND.com.
Thank you for listening to Native America Calling. We're looking at tribal banishments and how the traditional practice fares in contemporary justice systems. We also want to hear from you today. Has your tribe ever banished someone? If so, how was that carried out? What were the repercussions? What was the impact? Did it accomplish anything? Let us know. 1-800-996-2848. Our number is also 1-800-99-NATIVE. David Wilkins, one of our guests today, is a professor at the University of Richmond in Virginia. And David, just that word banishment, I mean, it just sounds so severe. I think it's kind of a polarizing term. It really gets people riled up. What do tribes need to consider about banishment before putting a concept like that into tribal law, codifying it?
That's an excellent question. Vanya Loria, back in the 1970s, he wrote an article and he said the gut question that Native peoples need to really ponder is how do we understand the meaning of what it is to be a Native community right now. And again, historically, since we were based on the kinship system with our connecting, instrument that kept us linked together, the idea of banishment, which it really is an exclusion, like I say, an expulsion, an eviction of someone that you're likely related to, is something that was simply rare. The word itself, banishment, comes from the Latin word banitio, which means exclusion by a ban or public proclamation. And so you were considered an outlaw. And certainly I understand the fact that many tribes, especially states in public law 280 states, and Matthew will be able to speak to this, tribal nations are really restricted by federal law in how much punishment they can mete out to criminals, to individuals who violate social norms. And so sometimes they feel they have to resort to banishment. But the problem with banishment, in my estimation, is if we banish them without due process and we banish them, where does that individual go? Well, they simply go to the next community. And if they are an individual who is a really bad actor, the individual needs help and needs guidance, needs to find a way to restore their own individual harmony. But when we banish without really pondering the implications of that, it leads to further diminishment of our inherent sovereignty, because again, the idea is that we are connected. And so I appreciate the fact that historically Native peoples, we use exclusion almost exclusively to deal with non-natives, right? And sometimes non-member Indians in our communities. And the Supreme Court has upheld that dating back to the 1890s. And so that was really the way tribes had to deal with non-individuals, and that's baked into many of their treaties, provisions allowing tribes to exclude individuals who are deemed detrimental to the community. But it wasn't until it's become a more recent phenomenon that tribes are resorting now to banishment, and I'm concerned about the long-term implications to our own psychic traditions and our own communal values and so on. But I appreciate the fact that Chairman, Mr. Seneca, is trying to work it out in such a way that the individual, and it's working out with state in terms of the relationship, trying to work it out so the due process is carried out. But it's still a very troubling situation.
David, I want to ask you one more question, and I'm going to bring Matthew Fletcher into the conversation. You mentioned situations in which tribes banish non-native people, and there was a very high-profile example of that with the former governor of South Dakota, Kristi Noem, who was banished by all the tribes in the state. And then prior to that, a state lawmaker in Wisconsin was banished by the Lac du Flambeau tribe after she compared that tribe to terrorists. What are you able to draw from these examples of non-native elected leaders?
Yeah, I think that's a perfect example of when banishment and exclusion is wielded properly for the right reason. Governor Noem was acting arrogantly and was acting in defiance of the decisions that the tribes in South Dakota had made to protect their own community during COVID. And she just felt like she could walk on their territory, and she's not allowed to do that based on the treaties that those nations signed with the federal government. And so when a tribal community is exercising that power to banish non-natives, they're wielding that power properly and sufficiently, and they're doing it for just cause, I believe. So I thought that was a very wise use of that practice in that instance.
All right, any listeners in South Dakota today, maybe you're listening to one of our partnering stations there in the state, you might have thoughts with regard to Kristi Noem being banished by all the tribes in the state of South Dakota. Give us a call, 1-800-99-NATIVE. Matthew Fletcher, law professor at the University of Michigan Law School, enters the conversation now. And Matthew, let's talk more about what happens here from a legal standpoint. Let's say a tribe formally banishes a tribal member who commits a crime. What's the legal mechanism to enforce that?
Well, the tribe's going to have some sort of police department to patrol the borders and make sure that person doesn't come back. That's an issue that is going to arise. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case about 20 years ago where it originated because it was actually a non-member Indian, but he had been banished from the tribe for a series of repetitive domestic violence convictions, and he came back, of course. And so these things are they're almost guaranteed to generate further conflict in the first instance. You may also have a possibility, especially in New York, because there's a precedent on the books in the federal appellate courts out there that when a tribal citizen is banished from the reservation, they have potentially a what we call a writ of habeas corpus remedy available to them. And I'm not sure exactly what that means. Typically, the habeas corpus means you're in jail by order of a court. And what the federal appellate court back in 1996 kind of said was that when a tribal citizen is banished from their reservation, their prison is the entire world but for the reservation, which is kind of a weird way of looking at it. But it's not exactly wrong. But that case is a bit of an outlier. I'm not sure that anybody else is going to go along that route. One more issue is the possibility that the person who is banished has property on the reservation, and they could be, if they can't access their property, the tribe is affected, kind of a taking, a confiscation of their property interest, and the tribe might be on the hook for that too.
Matthew, I think what's going to be really fascinating to a lot of our listeners today is this concept here, banishment. It really connects what we think of as traditional tribal law against the modern justice system. And what are the limitations here, and how do tribes go about striking that balance between tradition and modern justice? I'm fascinated by that.
When I was in law school in the 90s, there was a high-profile banishment. A tribe out west in the Washington State area confined two teenagers who had been incorrigible, I guess you'd say, to an island that the tribe had control over.
I remember that. It was in Alaska, I think.
It was Alaska, somewhere in the Pacific Northwest. And I just remember, as a law student thinking, wow, this, if I go into Indian law, this is going to be really interesting. But I've never seen anything like that since that time. The national reaction to it was basically to double down on stereotypes about Indians and, lack of civility and civilization and sort of behaving in these weird, traditional, even, quote, primitive ways. But tribes are doing the things they're doing now are out of a sense of desperation. That crime isn't just because of juveniles who are incorrigible under the law. They're exactly what the President Seneca said. You have hardcore drug dealers on the reservation. You have sexual predators on the reservation. This is all a function of, Supreme Court jurisprudence and congressional inaction in terms of ways to enable tribes to respond to a lot of this. David's right that tribes need more, more capacity, more resources to sort of prevent these sort of things from happening and to deal with them in a more traditional way. But most of those resources are not available to tribes in 2025. So that's kind of the road that tribes have to go down if they're sort of desperate. But when you do banish somebody, and I've heard about this in Alaska, I'm curious about your other guests who respond to this, is that if you banish somebody from one tribal village, they go to the next tribal village. You shove the problem into a different area, and that doesn't solve the problem. It just moves it to a different place, and that can be a problem too.
All right. Well, let's talk more about Alaska. And to do that, we have President Anisha Kritz on the line from the Togiak Traditional Council. And President Kritz, Togiak, your community has banished several people from the village. Tell us more about how that act is viewed by community members, and is it an effective way to address crime?
Yes, I thought, this was when we banished a non-tribal member. I think since we have the municipality here also in our village that was involved when we did that, and it did work with our community court. That's what we call it, our community. The whole village of Togiak was involved in this with the banishment due to drugs and alcohol. 2 young teenager ladies that were being used for those kind of issues. And when we did banishment for non-tribal member, we kind of got in trouble with the state of Alaska that it. After that, we never tried again because we still have the drugs and alcohol still coming into the village at Togiak, and we did banish other tribal members that belong to other tribes in our surrounding villages. And I know this will work here now that we are working together. We do still work together with our city of Togiak on the issues like this. And to me, that is very important when it involves so many deaths in our village due to drugs and alcohol that are coming in. And if we keep quiet about them, they still keep coming. But they slow down when we start talking about them, because we do have in our ordinance, we do have banishment in our policies that we could use.
Okay. Well, President Kritz, that is the question of the day here. I mean, it's worth noting that Togiak, your community, it's a dry village. So I want to ask you, I mean, have the banishments been able to reduce the amount of bootlegging and drug trafficking activity that was occurring there in the community, or do you think it's having a favorable result?
Yes, it did for a while, but it's starting all over again. And it's mostly our tribal members, most of them. The way I see this other person that we did banishment, was living here in the village, non-tribal member. But if we could do something about it more, because to me, it's getting out of hand, and our communities need to start enforcing that again. Because we did, as tribal court judges, we meet the planes at the airport for the drug trafficking and alcohol, but we got stopped by our state because the ramp down there at the airport belongs to the state of Alaska airport.
Oh, that's a good point to make, President Kritz. Yeah, I mean, the only way people can get into some of these villages in Alaska is by plane or perhaps on a boat. So that's a good point to make as well. Thank you. We got some callers on the line. First up is Timberwolf, who's listening in Cheyenne River on station KLND. Hello, Timberwolf. You are on the air.
Oh, hello. I appreciate your guys' work and on the fine points to banishment. But one thing I gotta have to state is that when we started banishing our people off the res, and if they get caught back on the res, they would stay 1 year in jail. But my thing is that what happens? I mean, like I think there should be like a parole, not like a parole, but like a period of where they could at least give them a chance to straighten up, but not go straight to banishment, because I'm not talking about like traffickers, but I'm talking about like users, because I think it kind of like pushes them to like go to more alcohol and drugs, and then it just kind of makes it worse. But maybe you could help out in that point. And then another point too is that I really like it when we banish the governor. And I give a shout out to Oglala Nation for doing that, and fellow Amsters down that way. And but yeah, that's all I have to say. And then it's a very interesting topic, because I wouldn't know if I was a leader. I wouldn't know how to fix all that kind of stuff. But it is very disappointing when how you say you see bad things happen on the res because of alcohol and drugs.
Sure. Timberwolf, thanks for calling in. Really appreciate you joining the conversation from Cheyenne River. And we've got a couple of minutes before the break. I'm going to have David Wilkins respond here. And David, listening to Timberwolf describing, like, okay, say somebody, maybe give them like a trial period before resorting to banishment. It just really reminds me that we're kind of dealing with shades of gray here, like when it comes to, like we heard President Seneca say earlier, well, they can come back and if they get healthy again, and who decides that, and what are the metrics to determine, okay, this is worthy of banishment, or this person has been reformed enough to remove the banishment. That just seems like a slippery slope in terms of how to make some of those decisions. We got about a minute before we got to take a break. Please chime in.
Yeah, that's where historically I know the Haudenosaunee in the Great Law of Peace, they have multiple provisions dealing with individuals who engaged in activity that led them to be banished, and the clan mothers would dehorn them and send them away. But depending on the crime, depending on the offense, they were almost invariably given an opportunity to return. And that's where I don't know what the process was. I assume it would be the clan mothers and probably some of the chiefs who would get together, and they would have made a decision on that. Same thing with the Cheyenne people in their tradition. They could banish individuals who had violated social norms, but they were given an opportunity. Sometimes they had to be banished for a year, sometimes 5 years, depending on the offense, and they would then be brought back. And if they could prove to the community, and I don't know who in the community represented that deciding element, but they would determine whether that individual had gotten their act together again. So we just have to get back to it.
All right, we're going to take another break. We will come back, and we've got a caller on the line. We have Auntie Evelyn listening in Albuquerque, New Mexico. Haven't heard from her in a while, so she's going to join the conversation. And, of course, we've got our guests on the line as well. So stay with us. We will be right back.
The annual 2025 Indian Nations Conservation Alliance National Conference happens October 14th in Las Vegas. This 3-day gathering of tribal leaders, professionals, youth, and community members unites voices and action around conservation, innovation, and indigenous stewardship of Indian lands and resources. The Indian National Finals Rodeo will be there too. Info and registration at inca-tcd.org. Inca supports this show.
You are listening to Native America Calling. We are having a conversation about banishment. How is banishment used in different tribal communities? That's the topic today, and we have another caller on the line. This is Auntie Evelyn, who joins us from Albuquerque, New Mexico. She's listening to the show on KUNM. Hello, Auntie. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Good morning to everyone. Hope everyone is well. I have two concerns or issues. And the first has to do with has to do with behavior that underlies many of the actions that result in proposals of banishment or whatever. And also, that is directly involved in the intergenerational trauma that is so widespread in our societies. And that is the existence of rage. My father entered Carlisle Indian School in 1913 when he was 14 years old. Your life with him.
Right. Yeah, Evelyn. That's a good question. That's a good concept to think about. Just what does this mean in terms of just emotion and trauma that goes back decades, generations among families. And President Kritz, I'd like to bring you back into the conversation and just think about in terms of the community and just the impact that policies like this, laws like this have. What do you hear from people in your community? And I'm thinking really not even necessarily the people who have been banished, but their children or their grandchildren or their next of kin. And and I asked this question earlier, what to the other President Seneca from New York. How does it impact families in the community just in the larger scale, President Kritz?
Okay. I know we are losing our children to OCS due to drugs and alcohol here in the village, and it really does impact the community and the families here. But in order for us for them to work with us, they cannot just come into our village and take our children away. That's what we have been also working with the families to get together, back together. The only way that they do that is they have to go treatment. And it does really impact the whole community. Like we are always saying that it takes a village to raise a child. And we have been working together with State of Alaska, with the Office of Children Services. And it does impact the whole community. Like, for instance, even if they are not my family members, it hurts a lot for them to lose their children just because of the drugs and alcohol that we are in the villages. And we're still trying to fight that drugs and alcohol issue here because it does impact the whole family and the whole village.
Mm-hmm. Right, for sure. Back to the phones where we have Miles on the Navajo Nation, the New Mexico side of the Navajo Nation, listening on station KGLP. Hello, Miles. You are on the air.
Hello. What's going on, man? I was just trying to speak to the fact of like sovereignty and like how you have self-governance, you know?
Yeah, for sure. What's your thought?
I mean, I'm just saying, like, if any tribe or whoever wants to handle their business the way they want, the state and the federal government should not be allowed to even intervene. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point of being sovereign, right? We're supposed to be. I mean, especially with us in the Navajo Nation, we're supposed to be the biggest nation, and Navajo Reservation is the biggest one, whatever. But they shouldn't be impeding upon us. Otherwise, we're just a puppet government, you know?
Right. Miles, I'm going to have Matthew respond to that. And Matthew, we have questions like this a lot. Like, to what extent can tribes exercise their sovereignty? How much power does their sovereignty have in an issue like this with banishment? We heard from President Kritz say they had some issues with the state of Alaska when they went to banishment. What can you add to this conversation here in terms of understanding the relationship between sovereignty, state law, and again, this whole idea of banishing people?
Yeah, so banishment is closely related to the fact that tribal nations are property owners of the reservation. And so, Sean, if you came to my house and you started rooting for a football team I didn't like, I'd probably make you leave. And that's just the power of exclusion. So, that's a pretty foundational power that every single tribe possesses over lands that it possesses, just like any landowner does. It gets a little bit complicated when a tribe enacts a criminal code and says we're going to start doing banishments as a criminal punishment. And Alaska is in what we know as a Public Law 280 state. So the state of Alaska ostensibly has criminal jurisdiction over lands, throughout the entire state of Alaska, except for Metlakatla, and they don't really have the power to dictate terms to a tribe.
All right, David Wilkins, I want to bring you back into the conversation as well. And I think what we need to also consider here is just the impact with regard to how this all works in real lives. Like, let's say somebody is banished and they suddenly get in a situation where they've been informed that they need to be banished, and how does that actually work in terms of getting them to that point? Law enforcement, do they come to the house? They say, we're going to remove you forcibly, and for how long, and What about disenrollment? Because that's an issue that we also need to consider. All right, so we're going to listen to a little bit of music, and then we're going to continue this conversation. Stay with us.
The earth is our mother. We are her children. We belong to her.
This is Sean Spruce, Native America Calling. You are listening to our show today here, and we have David E. Wilkins, who is a professor at the University of Richmond, and Matthew Fletcher. He's a law professor at the University of Michigan, and they are both our guests here as we continue our conversation on banishment. And David, before we went to that music, I asked just, can you give us a more of a detailed explanation for how this works logistically? Let's say somebody commits a crime and they're being banished from a specific tribe. How does that actually work? How does that action take place? Who's responsible for making sure that occurs, and in what form?
Well, that would depend. Assuming the tribe had an ordinance or some kind of law in place, that usually lays out the details under which an individual is to be banished or excluded from the reservation. And presumably all that would be laid out. I haven't read many of the tribal ordinances to see exactly what process they use, but as Matthew said earlier, it tends to be that you get escorted off the reservation and told not to come back. Hopefully there would have been some due process involved before that step, but in some cases there isn't. And so it really does depend on the severity of the offense. It depends on the legal and political sophistication of the tribal government that's doing the banishing, and it depends on whether or not it's a public law 286. There's so many factors that come into play. It's difficult to make one generalized statement about the entire process.
Okay.
But it really does depend on the individual tribe and what process they decide to enact.
All right. Let's hear now from Alex Cleghorn. He is the Chief Operating Officer for the Alaska Native Justice Center and a tribal council member for the village of Naknenak. He spoke to producer Sol Traverso about banishments in Alaska. The state does not recognize tribal banishment orders and just clarified that opinion last month. Cleghorn says despite the state's position, banishment remains an important tool for remote Alaska Native villages.
The tribes that we work with throughout the state of Alaska use banishments when they're trying to protect their community. Can be effective in preventing bootlegging of either alcohol or drugs, bringing those dangerous substances into a community, and excluding somebody. That's what a banishment is, right? Is generally an exclusion of somebody from an area, in this case, a native village. And I think that tribes in Alaska use exclusion or banishments when the situations are dire and have found them effective. We also found tribes in Alaska not using necessarily banishments, but using some exclusion when COVID was a real threat, when people were coming into the village. Tribes passed many laws around COVID excluding certain people from the village who may not have tested before coming to the village or met other tribal laws related to public health. Tribes as governments are often, in Alaska, the first responders on the ground to violence or other kinds of harmful behavior in the community, and are often responding in the best way they know how, with the fact that state law enforcement has not established a broad public safety footprint throughout the state. a third of the villages in Alaska still have no state law enforcement on the ground, and a state law enforcement response often requires getting in a plane or on a snowmobile, and can take hours to days for a state law enforcement response. And so I don't want to lose sight of that reality in this conversation, and that I think that banishment and exclusion, as well as tribal public safety responses, should be understood in that broader picture that tribes in Alaska and Alaska Native people are facing. The statistics around violence towards Alaska Native people, particularly Alaska Native women, are shocking and unacceptable, and they need to stop. And so I think that recognizing that tribes are the government on the ground that is best placed to respond to that and more deserving of federal and state support is important.
That was Alex Cleghorn from the Alaska Native Justice Center speaking about banishments in Alaska. Matthew Fletcher, I want to go back to you as we begin to wind down the show, and let's talk about another specific example of a tribal banishment. The Kickapoo tribe in Kansas banished one of their former tribal chairmen earlier this year after he pleaded guilty to several federal charges, including attempted homicide, embezzlement, and larceny. Once he served his time in prison, is there anything keeping him from returning back to the reservation now?
Well, that depends on the tribal ordinance or the tribal resolution that banished the gentleman in the first place. I was glad that David brought up some historical examples like Cheyenne Nation, for example, that would banish people temporarily. And we've seen some of that with some of the California tribes as well. And it's conceivable once he served his time that he could come back. He doesn't seem like the kind of violent offender or sexual predator that justifies or is the reasoning behind a lot of the banishments going on today that we're talking about. So I don't know the story of this gentleman, so I would have to defer on that a little bit.
Okay. David, back to you, and let's also think about the term disenrollment, because just because somebody is banished, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are disenrolled from a tribe. And I know you've done research on disenrollment as well. Tell us more about just how those two concepts coincide, perhaps, with an issue like this, where tribal members are guilty of crimes or being convicted of crimes, and they're in some way being ostracized from the community.
Yeah. It's really fascinating, really. And when I really got invested in writing the book with my wife in the late 90s, as disenrollments were soaring and banishments continued to happen at a pretty breakneck pace, and as I researched the two and why and how they were happening simultaneously, it really came down to two big issues. The first one, as we've been talking about all afternoon so far, is the rising, the very high level of crime in any country, particularly in Alaska. I'm really glad you had that gentleman speak, because Alaska is a unique situation where the geographical remoteness causes all sorts of problems, and I can certainly see why remote villages would have no recourse but to banish, because there's little else they can do to combat that kind of situation. But otherwise, you had crime that led really to the rising surge of banishments, and it was political power in the form of gaming revenue that led to the surge of disenrollments. And so the disenrollments have really supplanted banishment in terms of the number of tribes that are disenrolling their own citizens. And so that continues to be a problem that we've got to address, both of these simultaneously.
All right. Well, we have now reached the end of our hour. I'd like to thank our guests, President J.C. Seneca, David Wilkins, President Anisha Kritz, Alex Cleghorn, and Matthew Fletcher. Please join us again tomorrow. We'll have a conversation with Ojibwe author Angeline Bully about her new book, Sisters in the Wind. I'm Sean Spruce. You've been listening to the one, the only Native America Calling. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Skugtash. For more than 40 years, Ramona Farms has revived ancient traditional foods, tepary beans, pinoli, polentas, and more, all from store.ramonafarms.com. Ramona Farms supports this show. Omye. Support for law and justice-related programming provided by Hobbs, Strauss, Dean & Walker, LLP, a national law firm dedicated to promoting and defending tribal rights for over 40 years. More information available at hobbsstrauss.com. Program support by AmeriCorps Vista, where you can kickstart your career and help others in your community. With AmeriCorps Vista, you can serve in an office setting and address issues of poverty while gaining career experience and building your leadership skills. Learn more by visiting americorps.gov/vista today. That's AMERICORPS.gov/VISTA.
Native America Calling is produced in the Annenberg National Native Voice Studios in Albuquerque, New Mexico by Quantic Broadcast Corporation, a Native nonprofit media organization. Funding is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with support from the Public Radio Satellite Service. Music is by Brent Michael Davids. Native Voice One, the Native American Radio Network.